There are stories passed down through generations, tales that send chills down your spine. But what if one of those stories was real? A story so strange, so chilling, that it defies all logic. This is the story of a boy, a mysterious being, and the dark secrets that tie them together. In a small, quiet town in the mountains, there lived a young boy named Andres. He was only 8 years old, but his eyes, bright and curious, always seemed to be searching for something beyond what the ordinary world had to offer. Andres lived with his grandmother, Lola Teresita, a kind but eccentric woman who had raised him since his parents disappeared under mysterious circumstances when he was just a baby. To the outside world, Lola Teresita was an ordinary old woman, but those who knew her well understood that she was much more. She had deep knowledge of ancient rituals, the old ways, and the things that lurked in the shadows. Andres never questioned her strange habits, until one fateful evening, when something happened that would change his life forever. It all started when he wandered too far from their home during one of his frequent trips into the woods. Lola Teresita always warned him to stay close, especially at night, but like most children, Andres was driven by an unexplainable need to explore. Little did he know, that night, something ancient was watching him from the shadows. As Andres played near an old, abandoned hut deep in the woods, he felt a strange presence, something he couldn't quite understand. The air around him grew colder, and a distant whispering seemed to float through the trees. He turned, half expecting to see his grandmother's familiar figure approaching, but what he saw instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. A figure, pale and tall, emerged from the shadows of the hut. It wasn't human, yet it didn't look entirely like anything Andres had seen before. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its long fingers reached out slowly, as though trying to beckon him closer. Andres froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely breathe, caught between the desire to run and the strange pull of the figure's gaze. It wasn't until the figure spoke that Andres realized what it was. "Ang batang may gabay," it whispered, a voice like a soft breeze, yet filled with an unsettling power. Andres had heard the stories from Lola Teresita, stories of creatures in the night that protected the forest, spirits that guided those with special fates. But he never believed them until now. The being, which seemed to float in place, continued to speak. "You are special, Andres. There is a purpose for you. A destiny waiting in the dark, where no one else can follow." The word sent a shiver down his spine. But before Andres could react, the figure suddenly disappeared into the mist as if it had never been there at all. When he rushed home, his grandmother was waiting for him, her face grave, as though she had been expecting him. She didn't need to ask. She already knew what had happened, what he had seen. With a sigh, she motioned for him to sit by her side. "Do not be afraid," Lola Teresita said softly. "What you encountered was Diwata, a guardian spirit. It is rare for one to appear to a human, especially child, but there are forces at play that neither you nor can fully understand." Andres tried to grasp what she was saying, but one thing was clear, his life would never be the same. As Lola Teresita began to tell him stories of the Aswang, ancient guardians, and dark spirits, the boy's mind raced with questions. What did this Diwata want from him? Had it chosen him? And more importantly, what dangers lay ahead as he was pulled deeper into this unseen world? But before he could ask, a strange knock echoed on the door. Lola Teresita's expression shifted from calm to tense. The feeling in the air grew heavier, and the shadows outside seemed to grow darker. "Stay inside, Andres," she whispered urgently. There are things you don't yet understand. Things you're not ready to face. But was Anders ready for what was about to come? Only time would tell. The knocking grew louder, slow and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside knew they were being watched. Anders sat frozen, gripping the edge of his wooden chair, his small fingers turning white. Lola Teresita's face remained unreadable, but her hands tightened around the rosary she always carried in her pocket. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between the knocks was worse than the sound itself. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with something unseen. Even the flickering candle on the table seemed to burn lower, its flame shivering in the dim light. Anders looked at his grandmother, waiting for her to say something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening. Instead, she stood up, walked to the door, and pressed her ear against the wood. Her breathing was slow, measured. Then she whispered something, so softly that Anders couldn't hear. In prayer, maybe. Or a warning. A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the wooden shutters, but still, the door remained shut. After a long moment, Lola Teresita turned to him, her eyes sharp but calm. It has passed, she said simply, though Anders wasn't sure if she was trying to convince herself or him. What was that? Anders finally found his voice, though it was barely more than whisper. Lola Teresita took a deep breath before sitting back down across from him. She studied him carefully, as if deciding how much she should say. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. You are not like the other children, Anders. He frowned, confused. What do you mean? She tapped her fingers lightly against the wooden table. The diwata that appeared to you. It was not an accident. They do not show themselves unless they have a reason. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, something old, something knowing. Anders shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But pela me? Lola Teresita sighed. Because you carry a gift or a curse. I had hoped you would never have to know, never have to see what lies beyond the world of ordinary people. But the spirits have chosen to reveal themselves to you. The word sent a shiver down Anders' spine. He didn't understand. He was just a boy. He played in the fields, climbed trees, ran barefoot in the rain. He wasn't special. He didn't have any powers. But deep down, something inside him whispered that he had always known he was different. When you were born, Lola Teresita continued, your mother already knew you were special. She was afraid not of you, but of what would come for you. Anders' chest tightened. His mother. He had never known her. She had vanished before he could even remember her face. People in town never spoke of her. Whenever he asked, Lola Teresita would only say, she loved you very much. But now, for the first time, she was telling him something more. What happened to her? Anders asked, his voice barely above whisper. Lola Teresita hesitated. The candlelight cast deep shadows on her face. She tried to protect you, she finally said. But there are forces in this world that do not let go so easily. Chill ran through him. From what? She looked at him, her expression unreadable. From those who seek the blood of those blessed Ila the Diwata. Anders' breath caught in his throat. The Aswang, he whispered. Lola Teresita didn't answer. But she didn't need to, the silence was enough. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Anders' mind raced. The stories he had heard all his life, the whispered warnings, the old superstitions, were they real? Had his mother been running from something all along? Lola Teresita reached across the table and placed her wrinkled hand over his. Listen to me carefully, Apo. The Diwata does not appear without reason. It has marked you. It has chosen you. That means something is coming. And we must be ready. Andres swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to believe it was all just an old woman's tale. That none of this was real. But deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. Outside, the wind howled again, but beneath it, something else stirred. A sound too soft to be the wind, too deep to be an animal. A whisper. El breath. Something was watching. And it was waiting. That night, Andres lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling of their small bahay kubo. The wind outside had quieted, but the silence was worse. It made the shadows feel heavier, the darkness feel alive. Every creak of the bamboo walls, every rustling leaf outside made his skin crawl. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching. Lola Teresita sat in the corner of the room, her back straight, her hands moving silently over the wooden beads of her rosary. She hadn't spoken much after their conversation, only reminding Andres to never open the door after dark. No matter what you hear, she had said. No matter who calls your name. Andres didn't understand well, but he obeyed. Sometime in the middle of the night, his eyes grew heavy. Sleep started to pull him under, but just as he drifted off, a sound shattered the silence. A voice, low, careful, calling from outside. Andres knew. His entire body stiffened. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but there was something familiar about it, something that sent ice through his veins. It sounded almost gentle. Andres, halika, anak. His breath hitched. Anak. The word wrapped around him like ghost's whisper. A mother's voice. But that was impossible. His mother was gone. He sat up slowly, turning toward Lola Teresita. She was already looking at him, her face tense, her fingers still gripping the rosary. Don't move, she whispered. Andres swallowed hard, nodding. The voice outside continued, soft, coaxing. Bakit ka natatakot, anak? Ako ito, gusto lang kitang makita. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The urge to move, to get closer to the door, was almost unbearable. What if it really was her? What if she had come back? But then, the voice changed. It stretched, warped, turning just slightly off, endlessly. It no longer sounded like a mother calling her child. The tone was wrong, too hollow, too careful. Like someone trying to mimic a voice they barely remembered. Chill spread through him. Lola Teresita didn't blink. Close your eyes, she murmured, voice barely above a breath. Do not listen. Do not look. He clenched his fists, forcing his eyes shut. His body trembled as the voice grew louder. It was right outside the door now, the wood rattling as if a hand was pressed against it. Sharp scratching sound began, slow, deliberate, running across the surface of the bamboo. Then, silence. A long, stretched moment passed where nothing moved. Even the night outside seemed to hold its breath. And then, a faint click. The door. It was opening. Andres' breath caught in his throat. He squeezed his eyes shut even tighter, his body frozen in fear. Lola Teresita stood quickly, whispering something under her breath, words Andres didn't understand, words that sent shiver through the air. The door stopped. A heavy presence filled the room, thick and suffocating. He could feel it without even looking. Something was there, just beyond the threshold. Then, the voice spoke again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was something else entirely. Low. Raspy. Cold. Diwata's child, you cannot hide forever. A burst of wind shot through the room, strong enough to make the candle flicker violently before going out. The darkness swallowed everything. And then, nothing. Silence. Andres didn't dare move, not even to breathe. His body was stiff, his heart hammering against his ribs. Slowly, cautiously, Lola Teresita lit another candle. The dim glow filled the room once more, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The door was still closed. The latch still in place. But they both knew what had just happened. Something had tried to come inside. Something had spoken to him. Lola Teresita knelt beside him, pressing a firm hand to his shoulder. You see now, Apo. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel underneath. They know who you are. Andres looked up at her, his chest tightening. What do they want? Lola Teresita's eyes darkened. They want what they were denied a long time ago. The wind outside had started up again, carrying with it the distant rustling of the trees. But underneath it, Andres could still hear something else. A whisper. Ye promise. This was far from over. The next few days passed in uneasy silence. Lola Teresita kept the doors and windows locked at all times, never letting Andres stray too far from her sight. She burned herbs in the corners of their home, whispered prayers under her breath, and placed small bowls of salt near the doorway. Andres had seen her do these things before, but now, he understood, they weren't just old traditions. They were protections. Andres tried to act like nothing had changed, but deep down, he knew it had. Ever since that night, he could feel something lingering just beyond the trees, waiting. Watching. At first, he thought it was his imagination. But then, he started noticing the signs. At dusk, shadows moved where there shouldn't be any. The air turned thick and heavy whenever he stepped outside, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And sometimes, late at night, when everything was still, he could hear it again, that voice. Faint. Calling his name. Lola Teresita knew it too. Though she never spoke of it, her eyes carried the weight of something unspoken, something ancient and dangerous. She had told him the Diwata had chosen him, but she hadn't said Eli. Or what that meant. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the air blurred into deep shades of orange and purple, Andres finally asked, Lola, what do they want from me? She was silent for a long time, staring at the thick trees beyond their home, as if she could see something he couldn't. Then she finally said, there is a balance in this world, Apo. A balance that was broken long ago. Andres frowned. What do you mean? Lola Teresita sighed, her fingers tightening around her rosary. Many years ago, there was a child like you. Blessed Ila the Diwata. But something terrible happened. The Aswang wanted him. They wanted his blood, his power. And when they did not get it, they cursed this land. Andres felt his stomach twist. Child like me. She nodded. And now, they think you are their second chance. A cold shiver ran through him. He didn't know what frightened him more, the fact that they were after him, or the realization that he had no idea what they would do if they caught him. That night, as Andres lay in bed, staring at the flickering candle beside him, he felt the tension in the air before he even heard it, a soft rustling. The whisper of leaves shifting in the wind. Then, footsteps. Slow. Careful. Coming closer. He sat up, his breath caught in his throat. Through the thin bamboo walls, he could hear it, something moving just outside their home. Not an animal. Not the person. Something else. The footsteps stopped. Then, the voice returned. Andres knew. It was wrong. Twisted. It mimicked human speech, but the sound was too hollow, too stretched, as if something was trying to shape itself into a person but failing. He clutched his blanket, willing himself not to move, not to breathe. Andres, halika na di. The latch on the door rattled. His entire body froze. The scratching sound returned, slow and deliberate, running down the wood like nails on bone. Then, another voice. But this one was familiar. Andres, anak, let me in. His breath hitched. His mother's voice. Soft, pleading. Just like he had always imagined it would be. He felt something inside him break. What if it was really her? What if she had never truly left? Andres' feet touched the wooden floor before he even realized he was moving. His hands trembled as he reached for the latch. Then, a firm grip wrapped around his wrist. Lola Teresita. Her eyes burned with urgency, her grip unyielding. She shook her head slowly. That is not your mother. Andres' chest tightened. The voice outside turned sharp, angry. The wood groaned as if something heavy was pressing against it. You cannot hide forever. Then, silence. The air felt thick, suffocating. Even after the presence outside had disappeared, the weight of its words remained. Lola Teresita finally let go of his wrist and whispered, "They are growing impatient." Andres swallowed hard, his heart still pounding. What do we do now? She looked at him, eyes filled with something he had never seen before. Not fear. Not sadness. Determination. We fight. The wind outside had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. Andres felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting. Lola Teresita moved quickly, gathering small bundles of dried herbs, a vial of thick, dark oil, and a long strip of red cloth. She worked in silence, her hands steady despite the tension hanging in the air. Andres sat at the table, his mind racing. His grandmother's words echoed in his head. We fight. But how? Against what? Against creatures that could mimic voices, scratch at doors without opening them, press their presence into a room without stepping inside. Then, a sound broke through the silence. Not from outside. From the roof. A slow, deliberate shifting of weight, as though something was crawling across the thatched surface. Andres looked up, heart pounding. Lola Teresita didn't flinch. She tightened the red cloth around her wrist and handed another piece to him. Tie this, she ordered. Andres obeyed, his fingers fumbling with the fabric. Lola, what's up there? She didn't answer right away. The sound moved again, scraping across the dried palm leaves above them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, something that should not be. A shadow passed over the single candle on the table. The light flickered violently before steadying again. Andres swore he saw movement, something shifting along the walls, just at the edges of the dim glow. Then came a sound he hadn't heard before. A deep, wet breath. Not human. Not animal. Something in between. Lola Teresita stood. Stay here. Andres grabbed her wrist, panic surging. No. But she pried his fingers away gently. You are not alone, Apo, she whispered. The Diwata have chosen you. Trust in them. She stepped toward the door, one hand gripping the vial of oil, the other forming a fist around something small and wrapped in cloth. She reached for the latch. Andres felt his body scream at him to stop her. The moment the door cracked open, the wind rushed inside, carrying with it the scent of something rotting. It was strong, sour, metallic, like damp earth and decaying flesh. Lola Teresita's grip on the door frame tightened, her knuckles turning white. Then, without warning, a hand shot through the gap. Long, gnarled fingers, the skin stretched too tight over jagged bones, the nails blackened and curling like claws. The hand twisted, grasping blindly. Lola Teresita moved faster than Andres had ever seen. She flung the vial of oil directly at the creature's arm. The moment it made contact, a sharp hissing sound filled the air, like burning meat on fire. The creature screamed. Not just in pain. In rage. The hand recoiled, pulling back so fast it almost took the door off its hinges. Andres heard it stumble back, heavy footsteps crashing against the wooden porch outside. But it didn't leave. It logged. A low, guttural chuckle, like someone trying to force amusement through clenched teeth. Then the voice returned, no longer pretending to be human. You think you can stop what has already begun? Lola Teresita slammed the door shut. Bolting it, she turned to Andres, her face pale but determined. We don't have much time, she said. Andres swallowed hard. What do they mean? Lola Teresita hesitated. Then, finally, she said, they don't just want you, Apo. They want what's inside you. Before he could even process her words, the air in the room shifted. The candle flickered violently, the shadows twisting along the walls. Andres felt it before he saw it. Something was inside the house. A heavy stillness filled the room, pressing down on Andres' chest. The candle's flame twisted violently, casting wild shadows along the walls. He could feel it, something was inside with them. He turned to Lola Teresita, but she was already moving, gripping a bundle of herbs in one hand and clutching the red cloth wrapped around her wrist with the other. Her lips moved in whisper, chanting something low and urgent. Then, from the farthest corner of the room, a shadow moved. It wasn't Castilla the flickering light. It had weight, shape, a figure shifting in the dimness, unfolding itself from the darkness. Andres' breath hitched as he made out its form, tall, unnaturally thin. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Eyes like slivers of burning embers, glowing faintly as they fixed on him. A voice filled the air, layered and distorted, as if several mouths were speaking at once. You were never meant to survive, child of the Diwata. Andres' body turned ice cold. He felt something inside him stir, an energy he didn't understand, pulsing beneath his skin. The creature stepped forward, its movement slow, deliberate. It was in no rush. It knew he had nowhere to run. Lola Teresita didn't hesitate. With a sharp motion, she threw the bundle of herbs into the fire, sending a thick, fragrant smoke billowing through the air. The creature hissed, recoiling slightly, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it grinned, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. The Diwata cannot save him now, it rasped. Andres felt something pulling at him, an invisible force wrapping around his chest, pressing into his bones. His vision blurred. He staggered back, gripping the table for balance. He felt weak, as if something inside him was being drained. Lola Teresita grabbed his shoulders, her eyes fierce. "Listen to me, Apo," she said urgently. "They don't fear fire, or salt, or prayers. They fear you." Andres shook his head, his breath ragged. "I don't understand, you are the balance they tried to break," she said. "Your blood carries what they cannot control. That is how they want it." The creature let out a low, guttural laugh. "He does not even know what he is." A sharp pain tore through Andres' chest. He gasped, gripping his shirt. His skin burned, his vision darkening at the edges. Then, through the haze, he saw something. Not the creature. A figure standing behind it, a woman. Bathed in soft, golden light, her face blurred but familiar. The scent of damp earth and blooming flowers filled the air. A whisper echoed in his mind, gentle and strong. "Remember who you are." Something snapped inside him. The pain in his chest vanished, replaced Eli, warmth that spread through his limbs, his fingertips tingling with energy. The room seemed to hum, the very air vibrating around him. The creature's grin faltered. Andres took a step forward. A pulse of energy surged through him, invisible but powerful. The shadows in the room recoiled, the creature flinching as if struck. Its ember-like eyes widened, its grin vanishing. "No," it snarled. "This is not possible." But Andres felt it, the power, the connection, the bloodline of the Diwata flowing through him. He raised his hand, instinct taking over, and the moment he did, the room exploded with light. A force unseen yet undeniable ripped through the space, sending the creature crashing against the far wall. It screeched, a sound of pure rage and agony. The shadows around it writhed, twisting violently before being pulled into the earth itself, disappearing into the cracks of the wooden floor. And then, silence. The candle flickered once. Twice. Andres stood frozen, his chest rising and falling in sharp breaths. The room was still. The air lighter. Lola Teresita exhaled, her grip on his arm tightening slightly before she whispered, "It is over." But deep down, Andres knew it wasn't. Because as the last traces of shadow vanished, he heard it, a whisper. Faint. From somewhere beyond the trees. "Ye promise. We will return." The night was silent, but not in the same way it had been before. It was not the heavy, suffocating stillness that signaled something lurking in the dark. Now, it was the quiet of a world that had just survived a storm. The air was lighter, the weight pressing against Andres' chest finally lifting. He could breathe again. Lola Teresita let out a slow breath, her grip on his arm loosening. Her eyes searched his face, as if making sure he was still there, still him. He was, but something inside him had changed. The warmth he had felt moments ago still lingered, like an ember glowing just beneath his skin. He turned his gaze toward the door, half expecting to see another shadow shifting in the night. But there was nothing. Just the trees swaying gently, the wind no longer whispering threats. It was over. At least, for now. Andres swallowed hard. "Lola, what am I?" She reached out, brushing his hair back like she used to when he was younger. "You are who you have always been," she said gently. "But now you know." He wasn't sure what that meant. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know. But the truth was there, settled deep in his bones. The Aswang had come for him not just because they wanted him, but because they feared him. Because he carried something they could not control. Part of him wanted to ask more, to demand answers about the Diwata, about his mother, about what would happen next. But at that moment, exhaustion took over. His body felt heavy, his mind clouded. Lola Teresita seemed to sense it, guiding him toward the small mat near the fire. "Rest, Apo," she said. "You have done enough for tonight." He wanted to argue, but the moment he closed his eyes, sleep pulled him under. When Andres woke, the sun was already high in the area. Birds chirped outside, the smell of warm rice and dried fish filling the air. For a moment, everything felt normal. As if last night had been nothing more than a dream. But then he saw the red cloth still tied around his wrist, the remnants of the burned herbs on the table. And he knew. Lola Teresita was outside, her back to him as she scattered something into the soil, salt, most likely, or ground up leaves. A small act of protection. She turned slightly as he stepped onto the porch, giving him a knowing look. "The land remembers," she said. "It always does." Andres sat beside her, watching the trees sway in the morning light. Everything looked the same, but it felt different. He could sense something now, an awareness, a connection he hadn't noticed before. The wind carried whispers, but they were not warnings. They were watching. He looked at Lola Teresita. "Will they come back?" She nodded. "Someday." His fingers curled around the fabric on his wrist. "And what do we do when they do?" She smiled, but there was steel in her eyes. "We will be ready." The thought should have scared him. The idea that this wasn't the end, that something darker still loomed beyond the trees. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was something else. Stronger. Prepared. The Diwata had chosen him. And whatever came next, he would face it.